before I make any remarks, I want to recognize that this is National Archives Month. And so Ashley Miller, our state archivist, was kind enough to host the event and also put out a very interesting display on elections-related history. And so if you haven't had a chance to view that exhibit, it's certainly worth your while. This panel is going to be a very interesting discussion today because New Hampshire has been at the forefront of recognizing issues with ballot counting technology, and as a result of that has insisted upon the use of the paper ballot. And the people sitting at this table beside me have been really important players in regard. And so I'll just introduce the panel, who really doesn't need a lot of introduction, but on the far right over here is Secretary of State Bill Gardner, who served between the years of 1976 and 2022. He wasn't the longest serving Secretary of State in the country, but he was a very close second. And he's still highly respected among his peers for the work that he's done in keeping elections secure. And next to me is Anthony Stevens, who came on board with the Secretary of State's office in 1994. Anthony served as an Assistant Secretary of State and as the Elections Director for a long time. Another nationally respected individual in the area of elections and election technology, and did a lot of work with making sure that New Hampshire was meeting the requirements of the Help America Vote Act and other acts when that passed, while maintaining the security of our voting system. And then to my left is Kurt Hyde. Kurt was an adjunct professor of computer science at Rivier College, but was probably the leading individual to recognize the vulnerabilities of ballot counting equipment and the insistence that paper ballots were a necessity, that there had to be the actual document that recorded the vote. And these individuals helped organize the initial symposiums and discussions on this important issue in the past, dating back to the 1980s, and then subsequent sessions since then. So I'm just going to turn this over to Kurt Hyde to start with a presentation, and then once that's complete, we're just going to have I think a wide-ranging discussion. So Kurt, it's all
Okay,
yours.
thank you. I'll just make myself comfortable. I hope you can all hear me. What we'd like to talk about today is New Hampshire and the secret ballot. And New Hampshire played quite a role in helping the secret ballot. You see, British elections during the 1600s, 1800s was done with a thing called viva voce. It means in your live voice. What that means is you had to announce publicly how you voted, and somebody would write down your name and who you were voting for. And there happens to be over there on display a viva voce document from Illinois, because Illinois still practiced this, and that's from 1844. That document not only shows, so here we are, that's 180 years ago, and even we still know their names and how they voted, even though they're not around. But you will also notice, if you look very closely, that one of the candidates running for office, because you voted directly for the electors then, was a young upstart Whig man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. You've probably heard of him. And yeah, I think you have. Okay, but okay, so you got the list of names and your choices. It had an Achilles heel. The Achilles heel was it was open for intimidation and retaliation, but still it was what the British did until the Ballot Act of 1872. And that's when they went to ballots in England. This is that Viva Voce poll list. This is a photo of the very document you can see over there. Now, early American elections during this same period were a little different. Our people, they came over to seek different kinds of freedoms and things. And so some people, like Virginia and others, the two voted via the Viva Voce. They still kept that. But they also did some voting by standing. You might have heard of it. That's where all those in favor of this one will stand up, and et cetera. And also, they used to hold meetings in open fields if it was a local election, and whoever had the biggest crowd around him, they would say, "I will declare the choice upon the view," and they didn't even bother counting unless somebody said, "Yes, I want to count." But that was how they voted for. That was also done in some places. And some places use paper ballots, or they called them tickets. They also called them papers. Certain colonies, like Pennsylvania, the opposite of Virginia, Pennsylvania had that in their initial framework for when they came over here. It was like a constitution for the colony. So the early American paper ballots, you had to bring in your own ballot. They called it a ticket, whatever, or a paper. And sometimes, in some states, especially at the beginning, it had to be handwritten. If you brought in one that was printed at a print shop or printed in a newspaper like some of the others were, that would be evidence that you did not thoughtfully consider each person you wanted to vote for. And we actually have one here with a certificate of authenticity, and this is from Massachusetts. And of all things, this one is somebody who voted for Elbridge Gerry, the man who invented gerrymandering. So I feel like that's a pretty nice piece of my collection. If you're into gerrymandering, come see me. I can help, I think. Maybe not. Okay. But anyway, like I said, it had to be handwritten to be sure. That was however, some of the political parties bypassed it. And they held parties where people would get together and they would do handwriting, people with neat handwriting. And then that way, when people went in, they'd hand one to you that was handwritten. So gradually, everything gave way to allowing people to use the printed ones. But let's see, already got ahead of myself. Those volunteers wrote the tickets, they did them. Sometimes they were published in newspapers, sometimes they were published in print shops. And hope you can see this. As you can see in here, the tickets are being distributed, or this is a depiction of it. This is from a British publication in 1844, and this was what somebody had done as a picture of it. You notice on the right-hand side in a little stand are the Friends of James Knox Polk. And they would hand you a ticket that said you wanted to vote for James Knox Polk. Or the other one over here, he was with the Friends of, I can't quite read that name from here, but that was his opponent in that one. So this is just an example of what the tickets looked like back then. And as you can see, there are numerous shapes and sizes. Also, some were different colors, and deliberately so, like in California. They had found that people would do counterfeit tickets, and so they'd keep it secret what the color was till election day. So there were different ways, though. The problem is some of those things kept them from being secret ballots, because when you cast one of those, and I was helping you casting your ballot, I could tell by the shape and the size. So, but they tried. Okay, they worked to some degree. Here is a New Hampshire ticket from 1864. And we brought up a name that we've already brought up earlier here, and that's Abraham Lincoln. But this is when he ran for re-election in 1864, and that is a ticket, and those are the electors. And then here's a New Hampshire ticket from 1884, and it is for Grover Cleveland. And again, these are New Hampshire tickets. This is a typical newspaper ticket. You might see the newspaper ticket in here. Like I say, there it is. You would cut it out of the newspaper, and that's what you would cast. Again, you lost the secret ballot because when you flipped it over on the other side, there's some writing on the other side of a newspaper. And if you got it from one newspaper and somebody else got from another newspaper, the different newspapers would typically endorse a candidate, and that's the one whose tickets would be in that paper. They wouldn't have anybody else's, just the one that they were supporting. Pretty soon I could learn which side, once I learned what was on the reverse side, again, you lost your secrecy of your ballot. This is the handwritten ticket that I showed you earlier. And this is Elbridge Jerry. Nice to see him. And one problem with the secret ballot immediately was that you don't want to stuff the ballot box. You have to prevent the stuffing of the ballot box. If you're going to let me do something in secret or do something like that, you better watch me. Watch out for the sliding. Anyway, in Rome, the ballot was dropped in plain sight, and the public had the access to watch. And I'm going to actually go forward to this one just to show you. That's a Roman citizen voting. It's actually on a coin. This is on an ancient Roman coin. The man his ballot is being dropped into the cistern, and he would do that in front of us, and people, all of us watching, and make sure that he dropped only one ballot, and that sort of thing. Okay, now, so another way that we had was to put a small round hole, and you had to twirl it up in order to fit it into the ballot box. And that was so that when they opened up the ballot box to count the ballots and they unraveled them, you wouldn't be able to slip two in at once. Because when you unravel it, if there's more than one in there, they'd throw them both away. That was your penalty. That was your slap on the wrist. Another way of doing it, and this was really practiced, I think it still is being practiced in New Hampshire, is that the moderator will actually take the ballot, put it in his hands, make sure there's only one, and then put it in. But he does that in front of you, so you get to make sure that he's not cheating also. There's that Roman citizen voting. This is a man depositing it. Again, this is that same 1844 British publication. The British were saying, look at these stupid people. I guess they weren't really calling them stupid, but they were a little critical of people in the colonies voting with the secret ballot while they were using the viva voce. But if you look real closely, you can see where that is a round hole there, and that the ballot was curled up into a little tube to be deposited in there. And if you take a look at the man who's casting a ballot in there, it's the same thing. He's also in this particular picture. Believe it or not, some of these ballot boxes still exist to this day. And this one is mine. It's part of my collection. And that's what a ballot box looked like when they do that. There was another ballot box. This one over here had a hand crank. It also had a bell. It had a counter. And later on, we might talk to former Secretary of State Gardner to talk about an incident once where the taxpayers were saved by the bell on one of these. We'll get that chance. Right now, apparently over 80 towns in New Hampshire are still using their 1892 ballot boxes. They're still usable. So, and these were given to them as part of the implementation of the Australian ballot, which we will see later on. The glass ballot boxes were very popular. Samuel Joly patented the first one ever. At least he got the first patent on them. They addressed concerns about what they called the stuffer's ballot box. I don't know how real it was, but there was a fear of stuffers ballot boxes. These are ballot boxes that had a false bottom or a false side, and therefore stuffing the ballot box could be done in a sneaky way through that stuffer's ballot box. So, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not sure how bad it really was. I have quite a collection of antique election equipment. I haven't come across one yet, but if I do find one, I'm sure I'll be bidding on it. But what happened with the glass ballot boxes is it added additional transparency to a process that was already transparent. So it was really frosting on the cake, and I think it really improved the elections. If you can see this in here, right, this is meant to emphasize the fact that an African American was voting. They were allowed to vote, but they used to have a different set of rules, a different set of qualifications. Believe it or not, I ran into those by reading some old New York City newspapers in the 1840s, early 1850s. And then when we got the amendment that said you can't discriminate based on race, then New York passed a law saying this is the set qualifications to be a voter for everybody. And that was all, or for every man back then. That'll be a sore point here, I'm sure. But in any case, there's a lot that you can see in this picture that is not necessarily obvious to everybody. Number one, look at the crowd of people. You know what that meant? Everything was done in the open. Everything was done, it was a completely transparent process. What did it take to become an official poll observer back then? What it took was to have your clothes on so you could go in and go watch. That's about all. Just behave yourself. Another thing you'll also see is a number of these glass ballot boxes. So some of the other things are like that. This is another glass ballot box. Amos Pettibone invented this one, and there's actually one of them over here on the side. There is one, a real one, on display, so you can see it. So how secret was the secret ballot? Well, there were some ticket sizes and colors. Like I say, and in the case of California, there were some problems there where people were doing counterfeit tickets. And so, like I said, they would spread the word, and all of a sudden they would tell all the people, that all the Democrats would learn that morning, look for the color green, or whatever it might be, because of the real problems that they had with them. The newspaper, of course, like I mentioned before, they had printing on the back of them sometimes, so I could figure out how you were voting even though you turned it over on the other side. And in some places, I've only run into one, but in Virginia, when they implemented the paper ballots, they still had to sign them. They didn't allow them to be anonymous. They just did not want the anonymous ballot in Virginia. Most of us here would probably differ. But another thing they also had was, somebody also developed the idea, and it first started out in the early 1850s in Massachusetts, and that was the idea of a ballot envelope. And these little green ballot envelopes, if you can see them, sort of greenish blue, they're kind of small, and there's little ballots that'll fit in there. These are ballot envelopes from New Jersey, and I think these were 1910. So some people still use them for a while in there. And we'll put that over there with the other displays fairly soon. But those were the ballot envelopes, and that was another way of helping to make the ballot a secret ballot. And I got ahead of myself. There it is. There is a ballot envelope, and that looks just like this one. And this is from November 8th of 1910, and this one was from New Jersey. There was a problem with counterfeit tickets. Remember all those free tickets those people were handing you? Well, sometimes they weren't really the friends of James Knox Polk. Sometimes they were the enemies of that particular political party, and they'd hand you a counterfeit ticket. It would have James Knox Polk on the top and a couple others, but then the whole down ballot would be the other political party. Dirty tricks. Those things happen, right? And sometimes tickets were printed by factions within political parties. So say your particular political party has this following people. Well, you might belong to a faction within that party, and they would print their own tickets, and they might not be all the same. I ran into a newspaper that had the Whig Party, and it also had the German Whigs. And there were two different ballots. There were two separate ballots from inside the newspaper, and they all voted for the same people. They were the same ones. But if you were part of the German community in New York City back in around 1850 when this thing was printed, I'm sure that your particular friend who was the head of yours would be constantly reminding the other Whig people, don't forget, we're powerful, you needed our votes. Those things kind of happened, okay? But there were some very deceptive counterfeit tickets, like I had already mentioned. So there was a problem with counterfeit tickets. And like we said, this is that earlier picture that you saw. It's the same picture, but it just lets you know how those men are walking into, I believe, a firehouse. And like I say, it was a really pretty much uncontrolled kind of a place. It was very different. And then what happened was in Australia, some of the people came up with an idea. Why don't we have the government print a ballot, and the government and all the sizes, all the colors will be identical. and we'll also make it so that it can be folded in such a way as to hide what you chose for your choices on that ballot. And that was a major part of what the Australian ballot was all about. And this particular aspect of it has really improved the ballot secrecy. It also has pretty much ended con artists with counterfeit tickets. That's been just about shut down. And the American implementation did have some problems, and one of them is that in many states, even to this day, there's an increased difficulty for an independent candidate to get on the ballot. And that was not true in the Australian version of it. In the Australian version, it was easy to get on the ballot. And in here, sometimes, some places, the political parties like to control the ballot. But now the Australian ballot sweeps the nation. The very first use of it was in Louisville, Kentucky, in the municipal election in 1888. By 1889, Massachusetts held the first statewide election using the Australian ballot. And I would add in 1891, New Hampshire approved the Australian ballot. The legislature approved it, the governor signed it, and that's it. We're in on it. And that's fairly early, although this swept the nation. The passage in many states in very short order, it was really amazing how fast that went. And that was the Australian ballot. And here is a sample ballot. This one was from New Hampshire, and it's from 1892. And this is actually, this particular copy of it is of the first Australian ballot election in New Hampshire. So that's, and also here's a little something from the front page of the New Hampshire Manchester Union. And it's from 1892, and it's the newspaper coverage of this. And the newspapers were very positive in their coverage of the Australian ballot. Now, we had standardized ballot formats because once the government started doing it, they started doing it in a couple different standardized ways. And because of that, it enabled some new technologies to come about. And sometimes these technologies work nicely, and sometimes maybe not quite as good. So the first mechanical lever voting booth or voting machine was in New York in 1892, and that was to do that old-fashioned mechanical lever that would use it. Now the mechanical lever, it had, I think we'll go into it later, there are some problems with it. It does, for one thing, it does very fast results, that's good, but also there's not really a way to recount, and people weren't always good about checking to be sure that the ballot counters were zero for everybody at the start. You know, if then also what came about in the 1960s was the punch card systems, of which we will talk a little bit about that, and also the optical scan equipment. This is a mechanical lever voting booth. This one was used in Manchester, and that is that the mechanical lever, like I said, you pulled on a lever and that voted. The mechanical lever voting booths had the fast results. We love that fast results. I kind of got ahead of myself, but there was no real recount capability, and the biggest election integrity vulnerability was non-zero counters at the start. You know, if I had a 4-digit number and I gave you 9,990 votes and I took 10 for myself, what would really happen? Once 10 people voted for you, then the counters would just like the old odometer on the car would reset. And so that was a pretty dirty, sneaky trick. And there were other ways to do it. So non-zero counters was something to be worried about. And then, well, we're talking about punch card machines. Let's talk about Palm Beach, Florida. And by the way, over here today on display is one of those voting booths with the Chad's problems. and it's a genuine one with a certificate of authenticity from Palm Beach County, Florida. Yes, indeed, and there is one right down there. And then also, the punch cards really did have some problems, and I can tell you that when my students, which I got involved in this because I was teaching a computer science class, and we looked at the voting booth, we wound up calling Secretary of State William Gardner, and this, of course, was back in the middle 1980s, and I began to tell him how much I believed in a paper trail, and he began telling me, yes, thank you, that's pretty good information. By the way, he started telling me about his concerns about the punch cards, and I soon became a believer in what he was saying also. So, but anyway, punch cards did get phased out. You probably didn't hear much about this if you were watching the news in Florida. Of course, now that was 24 years ago, and we do have some younger people here, but it is kind of interesting that there wasn't very much news. There was only a little bit of news about the fact that I think they only talked about Massachusetts, but 3 states had already phased out punch card systems due to concerns about election integrity vulnerabilities. 3 states had already said no, don't knock on our door. And I didn't see much coverage about that, and I think the news media is at fault for saying that. Even though there are some news media people here, I'm not blaming you. Okay, but in any case, 1985, North Dakota did it. 1986, New Hampshire was a leader. They were number 2, but there were still 49, there were still 48 others, but New Hampshire went ahead and was one of the leaders in this thing. And then in 1996, the Secretary of State in Massachusetts had to call for help up here, talk to somebody. Anyway, we can talk about that, but he didn't really call for help. But they noticed that they had something go wrong, and the Secretary of State, under their state law, was able to, on his own, just decertified the punch cards and said, we're out of here. And then in 2000, Florida, and the presidency was hanging in the balance, and people are wondering, what does the dimpled Chad mean? What does the partially removed Chad mean? What does this thing mean? And yeah, that's what it was like. I think people do remember. The reason why I'm going to talk about this now is because this is how I got involved in all this. I was teaching a course in systems analysis at the Department of Math and Computer Sciences at Rivier College. And I led my students in a security assessment of brand new technology that had just come out. It was a computerized voting booth. And I noticed that there was no voter verified paper trail. The paper trail wasn't there. And that is how I and a couple of colleagues of mine at Digital Equipment Corporation got together, and we also had some help from our students too who were doing it, and came up with some strong reasons why, and also how it can be done and done properly to have that paper trail. One of the things that came out of because of this was the first National Symposium on Computers in the Electoral Process. And I was one of the 2 organizers of it. We held it in Boston. Like I say, this is the cover of the minutes of the proceedings. And I just thought I'd talk about my topics. What I talked about, my particular presentation in there was on the dangers of paperless voting equipment. There's no manual recount capability if you don't have any paper in there, and also public confidence is reduced if there's no manual recount capability. Public confidence. I'm telling you that I did it right, and I hope you'll take my word for it. Well, what if I can also show you and prove to you that I did it right? That's what the public deserves. I also happened to mention at that time, I don't know how I ever said anything quite that intelligently thought out, but at that time, almost all the computer chips were made in the United States. Only a handful of foreign foreign countries were making computer chips. Today, that's where they are. Now, who's making the chips that are going into these computers? Let's hope that they're not somebody who's not friendly to us, because if so, Are they really telling us what's in there? What does this chip really do? Is there something secret thrown into there? Another thing about them is that they relied on secrecy of operation. And secrecy can be a handy thing sometimes. It's harder to tamper with something that is a secret, that has some secrecy about it. But it's also harder to detect tampering if you're one of the good guys and there's secrecy involved in these things. Another person who presented there, and I was so proud of that, I was the one who invited him to that. That was Secretary of State William Gardner, who happens to be here today. He thought he'd cover some of the things about the history. He gave us a lot of historical information, such as the first paper ballot in American elections was in Salem, Massachusetts in 1629. The early ballots, like we said, they were printed privately. The first use of the Australian ballot was in Louisville, Kentucky in 1888. And how New Hampshire prevents stuffing the ballot box by having the moderator cast the ballot, of course, in front of you, but the moderator makes sure there's only one. He's not allowed, especially if you have an Australian ballot, where it's easy for him to look at your ballot all he wants. Your choices are hidden, but the one thing he can do with his hands is make sure that only one ballot is going in at a time. And then Secretary Gardner himself decided to give people a little information about punch card voting. And he mentioned that sometimes people have tampered with the punch card books, and when they tamper with the punch card books, you now could be punching the wrong chads. And that's stealing votes. That's cheating at an election. It's also very difficult to determine intent. That has to be done sometimes. And that's with a partially removed chad. What are the rules for which ones count and which ones don't? Boy, that's something. And sometimes punch cards can stick together when they're read. That can lead to some false negatives on the vote reads by the punch card equipment. And there were some informal recounts where they would take the same ballots and just feed them through again and see what they got. And sometimes they'd be off by 3, 4, 5, just a handful of votes. But the fact is, if you take them and you run them through and you get same ones, and you run them through and you get a slightly different result, you shouldn't get a different result. And they said, it just doesn't work out well. In fact, Secretary Gardner will be able to tell you if you want. I'd love to hear him relate that story about when he was doing a recount once, and that happened, and it was just something. But anyway, what happened in 1994? New Hampshire came in first this time. No more second place finishes for New Hampshire. This time we came in first, everybody. HB 1498 was passed in 1994. It was sponsored by State Representatives Leona Dykstra and Leo Pepino. And in it says, no voting machine or device shall be used unless it reads the voter's choice on a paper ballot and it is approved by the Ballot Law Commission.